Before we properly begin, I just want to say stick around to the end if you want a super secret surprise that only the most loyal of listeners get when they listen to this podcast. Enjoy! Hello, loyal listeners, and welcome back to another absolutely adequate edition of my philosophy book. Where did it come from? Well, the other day I was up cleaning my attic when I knocked over an old box. So I decided to sort through it, and in amongst the rubbish I found this old philosophy book. But unfortunately, another thing I found after I moved that box in my attic, there was a nest of bats hanging from the rafters. Now, I knew I couldn't leave the bats there, but I am an enlightened man. So, taking inspiration from my philosophy book, I thought I would use knowledge to my advantage in this situation. So, I picked up the book and I swung it at the bats as hard as I could. But after the sixth or seventh bat, I was starting to feel a little bit guilty, and it got me thinking about something. What is it like to be a bat? And that's not rhetorical. Give it a go yourself now. What is it like to be a bat? So, maybe you're thinking, I'll try imagining what it's like to be a bat. I'd have webbing on my arms. I'd be able to fly around at night, catching insects in my mouth. I'd have very poor vision, and I'd see the world around me using this system of reflecting high-frequency sound waves back off of things and then picking them up again in my ears. And then I'd come home and I'd spend the day hanging upside down by my feet in an attic somewhere. And now maybe you're quite proud of yourself. You're thinking, wow, that's a pretty comprehensive way of describing what it's like to be a bat. However, that only answers what it would be like for me to be a bat, or for you to be a bat. The question we want an answer to is, what is it like for a bat to be a bat? So, this question was first brought up by a US philosopher, Thomas Nagel, in his 1974 article, What is it like to be a bat? And 1974, I think, is funny because, relatively speaking, it's much more recent than some of the other stuff we've been looking at when you compare it to, say, Plato's work nearly 2,000 years ago. But this paper he published, What is it like to be a bat, in 1974, is regarded as one of the most influential pieces of philosophy published in recent times. And Nagel puts this question forward to express the discontent that he and other philosophers around this time were feeling with other philosophers who tried to analyze things in purely physical terms, physicalists. Physicalist philosophy. But what does that mean, analyzing something in only physical terms? Let's look at something like water. Now, we all know what water is, or at least you should, considering how much of the planet and yourself is made up of it. But let's just agree that we all know what water is. So, if we look at water in physical terms, we can say it's a liquid that also has the ability to exist in two other forms, as a gas or a solid, but in its current state it is a liquid. And that state can change depending on what temperature it is. It is composed of two hydrogen atoms and one oxygen atom. And that chemical concoction is what gives us water. So there we have it. We've analysed water in purely physical terms and quite concisely. So if we found someone who had never seen water or experienced water, describing this to them, as we have done, surely that would mean they would understand water completely. Now, if this sounds a little bit familiar, I think it does have an essence of what we talked about in Plato's cave. Do you remember in that episode on Plato's cave, I asked you to describe a tree as best you could for someone who had never seen one before? The difference between this thought experiment and that one is that when I asked you to describe a tree, it was to illustrate the idea that Plato had that no matter how well you describe something, we can never truly understand it using our limited senses. This experiment, however, of describing water is kind of the opposite. You see, the physicalists believe that everything can be explained in purely physical terms. a factor that I think has a lot to do with the rise of scientific discovery and the development of the scientific method relative to the time period these philosophers were working in. With so many leaps and bounds in scientific discovery being made, understanding things on an atomic level gave way to new forms of thinking. Physicalists believing that we could explain everything there was to explain and understand everything there was to understand in physical terms. So that sounds all well and good. And maybe you're sitting there thinking to yourself, I'm a person of science, and that makes sense. Science has given us so much: medicine, technology, and the internet, for better or for worse. So, what's this guy Thomas Nagel's problem? Well, he argued that there is a subjective character to experience. And what does that mean? It's something that is particular to the thing that is doing it, the organism. So we'll go back to the bat. From the bat's perspective, the bat is experiencing something specific to him. Although we can explain what it is, we can look at a bat as a collection of atoms that make up cells. These cells make up tissues that make up organs and eventually the whole body. And we know how these organs and body parts interact, giving the bat its ability to fly around using its webbed wings and find its way using echolocation. We can explain all of this, but what Nagel says is you cannot explain what the essence of being a bat is, what it feels like to be a bat. He says it's something that has to be experienced. It's not something you can explain in the second hand. So staying with the bat, let's look at how it moves around. It finds its way in the darkness. It finds insects in complete darkness by using sonar and echolocation, by emitting this high frequency and reading the reflections as it bounces back off of objects it is able to see. Now think about that, the way we describe it. We say the bat sees. Obviously, the bat isn't seeing, it's not using its eyes. But we have no way to describe what the bat is doing without relating it back to an experience that we have. It would be more accurate to say the bat hears its way around in the dark, but you wouldn't say that. You say it sees using echolocation. So the bat possesses this sense that is unlike anything we have. So it is reasonable to suppose that it is subjectively completely unlike anything we are able to experience. And though we may try to replicate the experiences this bat has ourselves, the experience is something that is unique to the bat and cannot be explained in physical terms. That's what Thomas Nagel is saying in this paper. Now, physicalist philosophers will argue against this, unsurprisingly, and they double down with their argument on the successes of scientific reduction. So what is reduction? Reducing something down using scientific method to its most basic form, and then using that as a way of understanding it. So, to go back to our example, we have water. Think of how long water has been on our planet, and as I've said earlier, it makes up so much of our planet and our own bodies. It is an integral part of our life, but how relatively recently we've only started to understand the components of what it's made up of. For hundreds and thousands of years, people did depend on water. They lived and died by water. But it's only in the past few years, relatively speaking, that we understand that it's this chemical compound made up of hydrogen and oxygen. So these physical philosophers say, look at all we've learned in such a short time. We've learned so much. This must be the right track. This must be the way to understanding things, even things like lightning. Think of how scary lightning was to people hundreds of years ago, and how people used to explain it as the wrath of the gods unhappy with the people. But now we know it's an electrical discharge. It's part of nature. We can predict them to a certain extent. So they say we know how everything works. We know what makes it tick. And that's the way you're going to understand the world, is by reducing it down to its simplest factors. However, Nagel does not agree with this. He says when you take a look at it, scientific discovery and the scientific method is all about objectivity. And what does that mean? It means no preconceptions, no biases, no personal input, no personal perspective. And to be fair, that works well a lot of the time in the sciences. But Nagel says that by moving towards complete objectivity and moving away from subjectivity, or someone's point of view, is the problem. Because he thinks if you are completely objective about something, then you will miss out on a key element of that thing. So if you look at water objectively, without any personal opinion or perspective, we know it's a liquid which can become a gas or a solid, and that it's made up of hydrogen and oxygen atoms. But Nagel says that's an incomplete description, because it does not delve into what water feels like. We can say that it's cold, and we can say that it's wet, but for someone who does not feel, for someone who cannot feel the way we feel, they cannot comprehend that in physical terms alone. They can't know what water feels like, what it tastes like, what the sight of water does to a thirsty person is something about it you just have to experience for yourself. And this does sound very, very similar to Plato's cave. And the lesson we took from Plato's cave, where he spoke about the realm of perfect forms, is that Plato believes you couldn't describe an apple well enough to someone because the apple we see isn't what the apple really is. There is a perfect apple out there somewhere, but we are just muddling through with our dim senses that don't really do the job. Well, Nagel says nothing really about the realm of perfect forms and doesn't comment on the shortcomings of our own senses. He merely states that experiencing an apple, or experiencing being in water, or experiencing being a bat is something that cannot be described. And whereas Plato condemns our senses as being the problem, Nagel puts them forward as being the thing that is crucial, the crucial element of his argument. Because we can only experience water from our perspective using our senses. So, to someone who hasn't got these senses, they couldn't possibly know what it is like to experience water from my point of view. And this does sound very similar to another episode we did not too long ago on relativity. So I'd say check that out because I go into relativity a bit more in detail. But moving on, maybe now you're thinking, well, that's kind of interesting. It's similar to thoughts we've had before on this show, but also somewhat different. You're thinking, this could be leading to my eureka moment. This could all be pointing to the moment of my life where everything comes into perfect clarity. Now you're clutching at your screen, begging me to tell you what Thomas Nagel had to say next. You want to know how he solved this problem. Well, he didn't. Thomas Nagel was quite happy to leave it at that, an unsolved mystery. The point of which was more so to get people thinking about the shortcomings of an entirely physical philosophy, which, as a side note, from doing this podcast, I'm starting to realize is a very philosopher-y thing to do, is where you come in, completely tear down someone else's argument, put your own question in its place, and then when someone asks you for an answer, you say, I don't know. But other people were not content to leave it as an unsolved mystery. There are some other philosophers who were following this paper and decided to take it even further with more thought experiments. In 1982, Australian philosopher Frank Jackson attempted to take things a step further by publishing his paper titled What Mary Didn't Know. And he gives us this thought experiment about a girl who knows every conceivable fact about colour. Well, she knows everything about everything. Let me explain. From the moment of her birth, Mary was confined in a black and white room, where she was never exposed to anything that wasn't either black, white, or some shade of grey. She had an amazing education. She was taught everything there was to know, everything we knew at this point in time she was shown. All the books she read were in black and white. She'd watched lectures on a black and white television. And by the time she had grown up, she knew everything there was to know about everything. about the environment, about the sciences, about history, about the world, about politics, religion, you name it, she knew every physical fact. Then finally, the day came when Mary was allowed to leave. She was let out of her black and white room. And, as I said, knowing everything she knew about colour, every physical fact about colour, that primary colours are red and blue and yellow, and mixing these shades you come up with various other colours and all the different pigments, she knew everything. She knew that red makes people angry and blue is calming. She knew green evoked images of nature. But when she stepped out of that room and she seen colours for the first time, she seen red and blue and yellow and green, she was shocked. Because she learned something that she didn't know. She learned what it was like to see red, and what it was like to see blue and to see yellow. And even though she knew every physical fact about the colours already, there was still this thing about colour that she didn't know. So, what's the point of this story and this thought experiment? Why does Jackson tell us this? It's because he's taking Nagel's argument further, saying essentially, there are some facts that are not physical, non-physical facts. He says that these feelings and what she learned when she stepped out of the room cannot be explained. It cannot be described or captured by physical facts. Therefore, physicalism is false. It is not a viable philosophy. Now maybe you're convinced, but the physicalist philosophers were not. And they took issue with this idea of non-physical facts. Some would agree with the idea that once Mary stepped out of the room and experienced red, that was a fact or a factor of it, but they contested that it still was a physical fact, while others outrightly dismissed the idea that her experience was a fact at all. And the physicalists obviously assert the fact that physicalism is true. This is another point of objection that they have. They say physicalism is true. So if Mary did know all the physical facts about redness, this would include the subjective facts, which is what it is like to experience it. And that once she stepped out of that room, she wouldn't have learned anything she didn't already know, having known all the physical facts. Now, for that argument to work, you have to agree that physicalism is true. So if you are a physicalist, that argument makes a lot of sense. If you are not, it's not convincing. But one deadly blow dealt to Jackson's argument by the physicalist was accusing him of committing the masked man fallacy. What is the masked man fallacy? It deals with Leibniz's law, also known as the identity of indiscernibles. So what does that mean? Basically, if you have two things, A and B, if A and B are identical, everything about them will be exactly the same because they're identical. Makes sense? So that must mean if A has something that B doesn't, then they're not identical. Think of two apples, two shiny red apples. Everything about them are alike. Every speck of colour, every curve and contour, it's the same. They are identical. But if you take a bite out of one of the apples, they are no longer identical. They cease to be identical because one has something the other doesn't. Simple enough. Now, this is where we put it into practice. So I was talking to my friend Ben, and I asked Ben what he thought of Ringo Starr. And Ben says he thinks Ringo is the best drummer in the world, one of the greatest rock musicians there ever was. So I said, okay, fair enough. But what do you think about Richard Starkey? And Ben says, well, to be honest, I don't know who that is, so I guess I don't really feel anything towards them. I'm just kind of neutral. Now, what Ben didn't know, and what you, the listener, might not be aware, is Richard Starkey is Ringo Starr's original name, his birth name, before he took his rock and roll name. So, I think we can safely say that Ringo Starr is identical to Richard Starkey, because they're the same person. Does it make sense? However, according to Leibniz's law, for two things to be identical, they have to share all the same properties. And if one has something the other doesn't, then they're not identical. So, this means the fact that Ringo Starr has Ben, who thinks he is the greatest drummer in the world, and Richard Starkey does not, it means Richard Starkey does not have a property that Ringo Starr does, meaning that Ringo Starr and Richard Starkey are not identical, despite the fact that they are the same person, which, you see, it doesn't really make sense. So there's a flaw in the argument somewhere, and this flaw has been characterized as the masked man fallacy. Why? Imagine you're sitting in a room with your brother, and you know who your brother is, quite well, I hope. But your brother's sitting there, then he gets up and he goes out the door, around the corner. You can't see him. 2 seconds later, a man walks in wearing a mask. Now, you don't know who the masked man is, but you do know who your brother is. Therefore, your brother is not the man in the mask. Make sense? Not really. But why doesn't it make sense? Because it's using results-based reasoning. What does that mean? Simply think of that episode of Simpsons where Springfield gets the bear patrol to keep bears out. Now, there aren't usually any bears, but Homer proudly says, because of the bear patrol, there's been no bears in Springfield. Which Lisa points out, there aren't usually ever any bears in Springfield. It's got nothing to do with the bear patrol. But we make these assumptions in our head, these subjective connections that aren't there. And the point that these people are making when they call out this masked man fallacy in terms of the argument against physicalism is that subjective experiences are not physical facts. Maybe they're non-physical, but in terms of identifying something, they are redundant. Think about it like this. If we go back to our 2 apples, 2 identical apples, they taste the same, they smell the same. 2 different people pick up the apples and take identical bites. So they're still identical. However, a person who has eaten apple A thinks it's delicious. A person who has eaten apple B thinks it's disgusting. But they both taste the same. They are identical. So, it's the person's perspective which is different. And the physicalists argue that this cannot be taken into account when describing something like this. That subjective experience isn't relevant because that's what it is. It's perspective. You may like an apple or you may hate an apple, but that's got nothing to do with the apple. That is you putting your own perspective on it. So what does that mean for the work of Thomas Nagel and Frank Jackson? Do we simply take everything we've learned from them today and throw it out the window, erase it from our memories? No. Although Jackson's arguments may have some perceived flaws, and they don't necessarily provide a definitive answer, I believe the points raised by Jackson and Nagel do pose questions which physicalists cannot definitively answer themselves. And the physicalists assert the fact that we live in a physical world. Therefore, the best way to understand it is by taking a purely physical and objective view. But I think there is something to be said of the subjective experience and the non-physical facts. And perhaps because they are non-physical, that is why they are so hard to prove that they exist. These non-physical factors, but I think there is something there. Think of the difference between me saying what it's like if I was a bat and a bat being a bat. I think rationally it's safe to assume that they might be different. And despite the physical factors being the same, there's that quality that we just can't quite put our fingers on yet. But that's been inside the mind of a bat in a nutshell. I mentioned a few other topics on this that I went into more detail in some of my previous podcasts, so maybe check them out if you're interested and want to learn a little bit more. And if you like what you heard, why not considering subscribing, so that way you can keep up to date on all the latest podcasts. But until next time, thanks for listening. Now, as promised at the start of the episode, there is going to be a secret surprise. Some of you may have noticed with your bat-like ears that when I was talking about results-based reasoning earlier in the podcast, and I gave the example of the Simpsons episode where Homer was talking to Lisa about the Bear Patrol, there was a slight moment where I considered going in to do the Homer Simpson impression, and then I chickened out. I think it's a bit subtle, but if you listen out for it, you can hear me think for like like a fraction of a second go, oh man, and then go no, no. So the super secret thing is just going to be me doing that impression. So here it goes. Bloody hell, woman. I blast my ass all day at the nuclear power plant. No, that's not it. See if you get that joke. Hey, Marge. Just because I don't care, and just because I don't care, doesn't mean I don't understand. I've got a problem. I am so smart. Homer J. Two alcohol. Two alcohol. Merge. 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 In America, first you get the sugar, then you get the power. Marge. It takes two to lie. One to lie and one to listen. So that was a series of horrible Homer Simpson impressions. I hope you found it worth it, sticking around all the way to the end to get to that super secret surprise. So make sure to subscribe for more super secret Simpson impressions hidden amongst all the philosophy.